So here's a quick comparison of what we call positive pressure breathing or lung inflation versus negative pressure inflation. And if you read the details on question 3 on exam 7, I've sort of spelled out who has which strategy, and the question follows from that. So reptiles actually most reptiles and all amphibians inflate their lungs by what's called positive pressure breathing, a positive pressure style of inflation. Here's what that means. I'll use a frog as an example. Everybody's seen the frog with the little pouch that comes out underneath the throat there, and it can inflate and deflate. It's called a bucopharynx. It's part of the buccal cavity. Buccal means cheek, so it's that sort of side and underneath portion of the head that is flexible. This animal, in order to inflate its lungs, will scoop up air through its nostrils into that muscular pouch, and when that pouch contracts, the air will be forced or pushed into the lungs. That's positive pressure. You're pushing the air forward from here into the lungs, and the lungs inflate. So what? How is that different than another animal? Well, if you look at a bird or a mammal, a human, for example, we do things completely differently. Instead, our lungs sit in a chest cavity that is separated from the abdominal cavity by this muscular sheet called the diaphragm. In the frog, there is no diaphragm. Its digestive organs and its lungs are all in one big cavity. There's no separate thoracic cavity or lung cavity from the abdominal cavities. There's one big cavity. But for a bird or a mammal, again, humans or mammals, we have that separation. You see right here and right here is the diaphragm. So when your lungs are, when you're at rest, after you've exhaled, the diaphragm has this sort of rounded up shape like this, and your lungs are going to have some air in them, but not as much as they did when you had inhaled. When you contract this muscle, it sort of snaps down, it gets shorter, and it creates more space in the thoracic cavity. So when this contracts, this cavity goes from being this big to being this big. Well, what's going to happen in response? Well, as long as you don't have a blocked airway, what's going to happen is air is going to be drawn through that airway to compensate for that increase in space. In other words, by making this cavity go from being this big to being this big, you created negative pressure. You created a vacuum. And really what that means is you're going to pull air in from the outside world through your nostrils, through your trachea, and through your windpipe into your lungs. So rather than having a muscular structure up here that pushes the air forward, you have a muscular structure down here that pulls the air in. That's called negative pressure inflation, as opposed to positive pressure inflation. Two very different strategies, and that may not seem all that important. You say, well, who cares? You're going to inflate your lungs one way or the other. And yeah, that's true, but this is limiting compared with this. And that limitation, the fact that this animal, a bird or a mammal, has this negative pressure inflation strategy is going to make its capacity to gather oxygen very different than that of this animal, which has a positive pressure inflation strategy. And that all ties into metabolism. The 3-chambered versus the 4-chambered heart also ties into metabolism. So with the heart, you're distributing oxygen that you gather. With the lungs and inflating them, you're gathering the oxygen in the first place. Notice oxygen is the common thread there. I'll leave that hint out there for you and see what you can do with question number 3.